Here on this Throwback Thursday, we're going to try and make up for a long ago mistake. In 1864, a poverty-stricken 80-year-old washerwoman passed away.
It was, alas, the kind of death that the world doesn't pay much attention to. No big obituaries, no crowds at her funeral.
The world would have taken some time to celebrate the incredible accomplishments, boldness, resilience, wisdom, and faith of this woman.
And that is exactly what we're doing here in Women's History Month. And Jim Duffy of Secrets of the Eastern Shore is going to introduce us to Jarena Lee. Welcome.
Good afternoon.
To Historic Studio
Good
D.
to be here.
So she wasn't actually from Delmarva or born on Delmarva.
No, not born on Delmarva. There's a couple of Delmarva connections that we'll get to. But she was born in 1783, the year of Yorktown and the American Revolution, on the other side of the Delaware Bay in Cape May, New Jersey. She was a black woman. New Jersey was a free state, so she was born free, but that doesn't mean she had it easy. At the age of 7, her family, presumably out of financial need, had to rent her out as a house servant to a family that lived 60 miles away. So she spent much of her youth separated from her family. Fast forward to when she's a young adult in Philadelphia, and she goes to church. Church doesn't seem to have been that big a deal in her life to that point, but she goes to church and she hears a preacher preach like she's never heard preaching before. And while this preacher is preaching, she hears a voice. It says, "You go out and preach." She tells the voice, "Nobody's going to listen to me." And the voice says, "I will put words in your mouth. Go out and preach." That preacher's name that she heard that was so inspiring to her was Richard Allen. So that's the first Delmarva connection, because he spent most of his youth enslaved on a farm outside of Dover. And then he made his way up to Philadelphia, and he's a giant in the history of American religion. He founded the first black-run church congregation that led to the African Methodist Episcopal Church all over the world. He was charismatic, inspiring, saved 1 million souls, but the message in today, maybe some Thursday we can talk about that, but for today, it's nobody's perfect. Because Jarena Lee went to him and said, "I've been called to preach." And he said, "I'm sorry, the world doesn't work that way. Women are not allowed to preach." She walked away. She got married, had a couple kids. It was a very rough time in her life. There were a couple of suicide attempts and some depression. And then her husband dies, and she comes back to Philadelphia, and she's in church again. The preacher in that church, and sitting in that church, is Richard Allen, but he's not the preacher. The preacher who is up there preaching loses his way. One account says he was losing his voice, and another account says he was just kind of confused, perhaps sick, and losing his way. And somehow, God must have lifted her up. Jarena Lee walked right up. They didn't have any microphones back then, but she walked right up, and if we pretend she grabbed that microphone and she finished his sermon in front of that giant of American religious history, Richard Allen, and ... brought the house down.
Wow.
Mic drop. And Richard Allen says, "Okay, you can preach." And so she does. She goes off on an itinerant preaching career. She's in New England, she's in Canada, and then incredibly in 1824, she comes down into the slave states of Maryland and Delaware and spends most of a year wandering from town to town. I mean, the number of towns that she went to: Denton, Greensboro, Dagsboro, Lewis, Berlin, Sinapatuxent, it goes on and on and on, Salisbury as well, goes on and on and on, and here is this single mother wandering around the slave state of Delmarva, preaching. The word must have got out. They said in Denton that people came from 30 miles away to go see her. They tried to arrest her in Berlin, but the paperwork that Richard Allen had given her and her free papers, she got lucky, and the judge told her, "As far as I'm concerned, you can keep preaching until you die." It's really an incredible thing in a couple of respects. First of all, the reason why we know all this is not because of old newspaper coverage or anything like that. It's because she wrote an autobiography. And she's the first black woman to write an autobiography in America. And she didn't just write it, but because no one would publish it for her, she somehow scrounged together the money and self-published it.
Wow.
She should also be recognized as the first woman preacher, not just the first black preacher, but the first woman preacher in America. But we're back to Richard Allen, who never officially ordained her as a minister. So instead, that honor in the history books goes to some woman from 30 years later. It's slowly but surely starting to get better. The AME Church has ordained her posthumously. There's a historian at Yale who's writing a book about her that has not come out yet. There's all kinds of articles starting to pop up in historical journals and things like that. And so she ended her life, in poverty, working as a washerwoman. Her preaching career was over, died in anonymity, and spent most of the next 200 years in anonymity. And we're just getting around to try and fix that here in Women's History Month.
Wow.
That is an incredible story.
Isn't it?
Yeah, Jim Duffy, Secrets of the Eastern Shore. Thank you so much.
You bet.